1907, Elizabeth and Philip have been the heart and soul of this country.
Most heads of state do not last as long as Elizabeth and Philip.
They have a record-breaking relationship that has weathered triumph.
The young couple happily share the supreme day of their lives with their countrymen.
And tragedy.
Philip said, well, I'm like a bloody amoeba, you know, I don't exist.
Grief.
We have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death.
And glory.
The Queen and Prince Philip represent that idea of putting duty first and devoting your life to public service.
As royal commentators dispel the myth of the monarchy.
Famously, she's supposed to have remarkable bladder control. She can sit through hours of boring events.
They ended up with the king doing the conga around the staterooms of Buckingham Palace.
Experts will break down key archive from crucial moments in royal history.
It's a fairy tale created by the Grimm brothers.
Anybody entering the royal circles needs to come with their A game.
So prepare to discover what actually happens when blue blood runs red.
What have you been doing in here all day?
This is The Royals Revealed. In this episode, it's revealed how the Queen and Prince Philip have stoically kept the monarchy going.
I think the most remarkable thing about Elizabeth and Philip, they are a team, and as they've got older, the sense that they're a team has become more distinct.
And they are also willing to hold on to tradition while also behaving in progressive ways that we can then relate to. So I think that might be the magic combination.
Their consistent devotion to duty, monarchy and marriage for over 70 years.
They're probably more in touch with the people than any other sovereign has been before. They look upon her as reassurance.
Has made them the world's most recognised royals.
If you talk about the royal family, people immediately think about our royal family.
But more importantly, the parents of our nation. So how did this royal romance, a marriage that has crossed over 2 millennia, begin?
Princess Elizabeth wrote a wonderful letter to a lady called Betty Shaw. She explained their meeting. She said, we could have met on several occasions, but the only time I really remember meeting him was when I went with my parents to Dartmouth Naval College.
Since 1863, Dartmouth Naval College has been the training ground for the best the senior service can produce. Here, cadets and even future kings have literally learnt the ropes before graduating as officers for a life at sea.
While Father was doing official duties on the passing out parade, Prince Philip was charged with looking after the princesses, and he showed them around the place.
But perhaps this was not a chance meeting.
Well, Dickie Mountbatten was a great kingmaker, and he loved to enable people to get together. So what he obviously thought, what my nephew needs is a wonderful, rich, titled wife. Well, I mean, you couldn't get better than Princess Elizabeth.
I think this photograph of Elizabeth meeting Philip for the first time, Elizabeth was only 13, and that's very much the age when a lot of girls have crushes. And to be given this 13-year-old girl to sort of go off and play with for the rest of the day, you can almost see in his body language a kind of that slight exhaustion that an 18-year-old boy would have. Oh no, it was just the worst of all options.
But they hit it off. I mean, it's a bit of an old chestnut that Philip impressed Elizabeth because he could jump over a tennis net.
The young but confident princess knew what she wanted and was determined to marry Philip.
I think the decision of the relationship was all Princess Elizabeth. She's the one that fell in love with Philip. She's the one that decided, this is the only man in my life.
But interrupting this budding romance was an event that would change not just their lives, but those of millions of couples and families around the world. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. Philip's first posting was as a midshipman on HMS Ramillies in 1940 in the South Pacific.
He served with distinction during the Second World War, firstly in the European theatre and then in the Far Eastern theatre. He was mentioned in dispatches.
Having outwitted the Italian fleet and saving his ship in a brilliant, evasive tactical manoeuvre, Philip loved everything about the Navy and was always ready for action, at sea and ashore.
Philip was always a huge charmer, especially in his young days. Women fell over him because he was so handsome, and he was the most beautiful dancer I have seen. And he and the Queen had dancing in common. They're both absolutely fantastic dancers. And to this day, they still love to dance.
Philip was certainly a ladies' man. I mean, to some extent, he led a sort of double life, you know. He was one of the lads while he was in the Navy. And then, you know, on leave, he would have behaved in a much more circumspect way, a much more dignified way, a way, you know, that would have fitted his role as a prince.
Away for months at a time, Philip maintained the relationship by writing letters. So when he did get a bit of brief shore leave back in Blighty, Philip would be invited to stay at Windsor Castle.
In 1943, Prince Philip spent Christmas at Windsor Castle, and Philip's head was then turned by the young Princess Elizabeth.
With the war over and Philip finally back in Britain in 1946, he was desperate to get their relationship back on track, but there were problems.
George VI was very protective to his two daughters. I think he felt that Elizabeth needed to be older, partly because Philip he had a reputation for being a bit of a lad. If he were to marry Elizabeth, he had to do it properly. He had to do it in the traditional way.
The sacrifice Philip had to make to marry Princess Elizabeth was to renounce his titles. He was no longer being able to call himself a Prince of Greece and a Prince of Denmark.
It made it very obvious that Philip was prepared to do whatever was necessary to make himself acceptable to the royal family and to the British public in general.
On Wednesday, the 9th of July, 1947, the official announcement was finally made, with the marriage at Westminster Abbey 4 months later, on the 20th of November. This was to be the beginning of a very eventful partnership spanning over 70 years. After Philip and Elizabeth's marriage in 1947,
They proceed with a brilliantly uniformed mounted guards through throngs estimated at 2 millions.
this was undoubtedly the couple's honeymoon period.
In the early years of Philip and Elizabeth's marriage, before she became queen, the relationship was much closer to the traditional marriage that anyone might have had at the time. The man was the boss. He would have felt the top cat in the relationship.
But married life brought inevitable change. Philip was a distinguished and serving naval officer who had just become a member of the British royal family.
There was a sense that Prince Philip was delighted to be married, but felt somewhat cast adrift in his own career. Was he going to be a full-time working royal in support of a then young Princess Elizabeth? Was he going to continue with the Navy, and if so, what was he going to do?
In an attempt to maintain his independence, Philip also kept up something of a bachelor lifestyle.
So I think there was a sense when he first married into the royal family that he felt a little bit trapped and didn't really want a huge entourage around him scrutinising his every move.
One way of escaping the royal routine and palace pressures was the Thursday Club.
Philip had his male friends. Amongst them was the photographer Baron. And Baron introduced Philip to something called the Thursday Club. When people got to hear about the Thursday Club, they imagined it was some sort of place where the men got very drunk and then went off with all kinds of women, which actually wasn't the case. There was a lot of sort of male laughter and drinking, but there wasn't womanizing.
It was all hijinks, but essentially harmless. Elizabeth even referred to the Thursday Club as Philip's funny friends, but seems to have accepted he was a man of his time and background, just as she was of hers.
Philip himself said she's incredibly tolerant and understanding. When they were first married, he was allowed to go and do his thing because otherwise it would have been very difficult for him, always playing second fiddle to Elizabeth and being this person in the background without not really having a role.
Despite the clubland capers, Philip and Elizabeth were quick to produce an heir. Prince Charles was born in 1948.
He was the first baby born to a British heir presumptive in 1,000 years.
But Philip was still a serving naval officer, keen to advance his career, and in late 1949 was posted overseas to Malta as first lieutenant aboard HMS Chequers.
Probably the happiest time was when Philip was posted to Malta, and Elizabeth spent months there. She did. Well, these weren't flying visits. She really enjoyed it. It was an exotic location. Because you forget being queen in waiting, being a member of the royal family, there are a lot of constraints. And when you live abroad, some of those constraints either disappear or they change.
Philip took work seriously, making his new ship, HMS Magpie, one of the finest in the fleet. But the best times were when the couple were together, or at least nearby.
When Prince Philip was at sea, the Queen used to stay on HMS Surprise, and the couple, newly married and still full of a sense of excitement, used to signal to each other from ship to ship. There was a famous signal, I think, from Surprise to Magpie, saying that the princess was full of beans, and the prince replied, "Couldn't she have something different for breakfast?"
But whilst the young, loving couple were having fun in the sun, there was trouble on the horizon. The ever-deteriorating health of Elizabeth's father, King George VI.
George VI, like his father, was a heavy smoker. He was very ill from the late 1940s, had to have one lung removed or part of it removed. I think it was generally accepted his health was so poor that he would not survive that much longer. And he was aware at the same time of just how young Elizabeth was and what an enormous burden she would suddenly have to cope with.
On the 31st of January 1951, heir apparent, Elizabeth and her husband Philip took over her father's royal responsibilities by flying out to Nairobi, Kenya for the opening leg of a Commonwealth tour.
So they arrived in Nairobi, they spent a couple of days there, and then they drove out to their fishing lodge, Sangwa Lodge. And from there they went to a viewing platform called Treetops. Elizabeth had been talking to the game warden about how her father had actually told her that he was able to lift a gun and that he'd been out shooting. And she was full of happiness, thinking, this is wonderful, Papa's been out shooting, he's getting better. And then this terrible news came in.
At 2:45 p.m. local time, already 11:45 in London, and already over 4 hours after the King's death, Philip was informed of this life-changing and tragic news. It was devastating.
When Lord Charteris told Prince Philip that the King had died, I think there was a moment where he lay back on a hammock and put a newspaper over his face, I think, just to give himself 5 minutes to think not only how to break this news to his wife, but also probably to contemplate what the future lay for them both at that very moment.
But he immediately knew what he had to do. So he went and woke Elizabeth, and he walked her down to the river at the bottom of the garden. And he walked up and down and up and down. And we have all this detail because, Pamela Mountbatten, who was the lady in waiting, she was watching. That they were watching, and they knew that Philip was telling her. And then they came back into the lodge, and Pamela Mountbatten was about to put her arms round the now Queen, but she suddenly realised she was Queen, so she dropped into a curtsy.
Meanwhile in London, Operation Hyde Park Corner, the official plans for the King's death, were in full swing. The nation was in mourning and seemed to have lost all direction. There was going to be a lot of pressure on the young Queen preparing to fly back from Africa.
So unexpected was King George VI's death that the Queen was completely unprepared as far as her wardrobe was concerned. So when her plane landed at Nairobi airport, she did have to transfer to another plane wearing the summer floral dress that she'd been wearing all day on safari. She felt that it would be inappropriate to be seen wearing effectively quite a whimsical outfit.
And Mike Parker went out and asked the photographers that they would respectfully refrain from taking any photographs. And I think it's very moving that they put down their cameras and they just stood with their heads bowed.
The pilot of the plane who flew Elizabeth and Philip back from Kenya found it extraordinary that she insisted on standing in the cockpit. She was leaning over from behind, watching the controls, watching the runway coming toward them, doing this dangerous thing to steel herself for the shock, the fact that she was now queen, that the whole of the country would be in mourning for her father. And so if she could do this, perhaps what was coming next wouldn't be quite so difficult.
When the flight eventually landed back at London Airport, the Queen stepped out first, this tiny figure in her mourning clothes, and Prince Philip stayed back, and he came down the aeroplane steps behind her, 2 steps behind, which was something he was going to be for the rest of his life.
For the career-minded and ambitious naval officer Philip, it must have felt like he'd been cast adrift.
I think it very quickly dawned on Philip that things would never be the same again.
Here you have a man who is very masculine. He had his own identity. He is a red-blooded male, particularly if you think about the social context and the times. Finding yourself in the supporting role as a man would have been very, very difficult to swallow. And I think he stepped up and understood that, he had to make compromises. And actually, I think what he made was sacrifices to play that role.
To bless the Royal Princess Elizabeth II with long and happy years to reign over us.
Whilst the young Queen Elizabeth was surrounded by courtiers and politicians advising her how to do her new job, Prince Philip was left high and dry in his new role as consort.
The role of consort, effectively, is the supporting act to whoever is head of state. And that person is effectively a +1 who is operating in support of their partner. And that effectively means putting a lot of your own ambitions on hold or cancelling them altogether. In Prince Philip's case, of course, effectively having to end his own naval career in support of the Queen.
Philip needed advice about how to behave as a consort, and the only available mentor was Prince Bernhard, 15 years in the job as consort to Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, and helpfully, a distant cousin of the Queen.
And he gave Philip some very wise advice, basically saying, look, whatever you do, it's going to be wrong. And whatever you do, you're going to be criticised. And whatever you do, it isn't going to be the right thing. And people will be very envious of you and they'll be wanting to, to find out anything that you might do wrong. So he said, what you've got to do, old boy, is you've got to have skin like a rhinoceros for this game, and then you'll survive.
Having already been excluded from affairs of state, a new blow for Philip was the news that his children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, who had been born in the summer of 1950, would not bear his name.
Philip was extremely anxious that his own children should bear his own name, and that was Philip Mountbatten. But the Mountbatten name sounded too Germanic. So the Queen thought, well, what about changing the name? And Prince Philip thought, well, let's change the name. But the government of the day didn't like that either. Then the Queen thought, well, maybe we could have Mountbatten Windsor. But no, that wasn't acceptable either at this stage. So in the end, they were just called Windsor. And this upset Philip hugely, because he famously said, well, I'm like a bloody amoeba, I don't exist.
The next inevitable milestone for the young couple would be Elizabeth's coronation, an event that would seal their fate for the rest of their lives.
Philip felt completely left out now. He felt that there was no place for him in this massive thing that was happening around and for his wife. And he was made the chair of the Coronation Commission. And in fact, actually, he did one thing in that role for which historians have always been immensely grateful. He was the person who came up with the idea, and there was a lot of opposition to this, that the coronation should be filmed, it should be televised.
He was very, very keen on getting the monarchy into the 20th century, albeit in 1953 it was the middle of the 20th century, and he was very much for it, and he persuaded the Queen to go along with it, and she agreed.
Which is why we now have footage of one of the most important coronations of the last century, given that it's led to this record-breaking reign by Elizabeth.
After years of war and austerity, the nation's hopes were pinned on the young Queen Elizabeth and her dashing consort, Prince Philip. This, the greatest of all royal couples, began the tough task of carving out solid roles for themselves and making their mark on history. For all monarchs, the duty of dynastic succession is the most important. Continuing the family line is meant to create stability, consolidate power, and maintain tradition. But the royal commitments now dominating Elizabeth and Philip's lives, such as the 1951 Canada tour, duty came first, and that meant country, not kids.
There was a bit of consternation at the notion of the Queen and Prince Philip going away on tours that lasted months on end. This idea that the Queen and Prince Philip were quite unfeeling as parents, I think, permeated.
In the early years, Philip was juggling a naval career with desire for a bachelor lifestyle and royal duties. The demands of fatherhood further complicated things, and he treated his children very differently.
I think Princess Anne was always regarded as a bit of a daddy's girl, very much having the same temperament as her father, the same interests. Prince Philip famously saying that if it didn't fart or eat hay, then Anne wasn't interested. I think Prince Charles, by his own admission, had difficult relationships with both of his parents. I think he found his mother, the Queen, lacking in emotion at times, and his father to be a little unsympathetic.
But Philip still played an important, even defining role in their upbringing, especially when it came to decisions about their education.
Philip had had a very tough childhood, and it made him a very tough man. And when he came to time to be a parent, I don't think he was the sort of parent who believed in mollycoddling his children, and especially his sons. And I think myself that Charles suffered very badly as a result. And I think when he was a baby and then a toddler and a young boy, I think Philip felt that he needed to be toughened up.
The Queen acquiesced, as she usually did with Prince Philip on matters of the children. She let him handle it because she was so busy being Queen.
A man, if you like, who's been stripped of multiple roles to become the Queen's consort, effectively emasculated in a lot of ways. But then to step into the role of taking charge of your children's education is an incredibly powerful role, because what you're doing there is shaping their future.
Charles initially was educated sort of on the nursery floor and then ended up going to school where he had quite a miserable time, and subsequently ended up at Gordonston, where he had an equally miserable time, describing it as coldits in kilts. Anne, on the other hand, was homeschooled and then insisted that she should be sent to school. She didn't want to be educated on the nursery floor, and she ended up going to Benenden and enjoying it, but wasn't particularly academic.
Things were very different for Andrew and Edward. On the 19th of February 1960, 12 years after Philip and Elizabeth were married, Andrew was born. He was the first child to be born to a reigning monarch in over a century.
By the time that Prince Andrew was born in 1960, the Queen knew exactly what she was doing, and Andrew enjoyed a far more hands-on relationship with his mum.
Andrew was shielded from the press. There weren't even any official baby snaps as the proud new dad took them all himself.
I do think that there is something about the eldest child being treated one particular way and then the next child, and then you get the opportunity to be more hands-on with your younger two. They're going to have a different version of you as mum. That is going to change the dynamics of those relationships and how they behave.
Having been on the throne for 8 years, Elizabeth was used to the job and had more time for Andrew, having him for whole mornings playing on the floor whilst she worked at her desk. Philip seemed to find fatherhood more enjoyable too. He even occasionally looked after Andrew, but was easily distracted, giving Andrew the opportunity to make mischief.
The Queen's head coachman at the time told me a wonderful story about Prince Andrew making a horrible nuisance of himself down at the Mews in Windsor. And he would go round there and he'd sort of kick the horses' feet and, tweak them to make them do something, and then watch the reaction of the grooms and things. And he was being such a pest one day that they picked him up by his sort of shoulder and the seat of his pants, and they threw him on the dung heap. So he was a very naughty little boy, but he wasn't a nasty little boy. He was just a typical boy.
Elizabeth had always wanted 4 children, and on the 10th of March 1964, Edward was born.
There are several ways of looking at where the Queen was when Edward was born. Here you've got a woman who is now a working mum. She's juggling several roles. She has a diary that states that she wants to fit in bath and bedtime with Edward. This is her opportunity now to be more connected and bonded with her youngest child. Maybe this is the time that she wanted to give that attention and love and acknowledgement that children need that connection. So you've got a working mum who's juggling. Way ahead of her time.
Whilst the Queen was embracing change and adapting to new parenting trends, rumours persisted that family man Philip was also very much a ladies' man.
I think the rumours about Philip's infidelities have persisted because there are so many of these that it's very difficult to believe that he has always been whiter than white.
Prince Philip has always liked glamorous ladies. He's never made any pretense that he doesn't. That he's always had an eye for the best-looking girl in the room.
Philip has always liked to flirt and make suggestive remarks, and apparently the Queen is always the first to make jokes about his flirtatious nature. And ultimately, whatever the rumours, they're still together.
Philip is the sort of person who window shops, but he doesn't buy. There's only been one man in the Queen's life, and that's been Prince Philip. They adore each other as much today, 72 years on, as they did when they first met.
25 years after their marriage, in November 1972, Elizabeth and Philip celebrated their silver wedding anniversary at the Guildhall in London.
She mentions the fact that you have to work at a relationship, that marriages don't just happen. They're created, they develop, they change over time. And it's almost as if she's acknowledging that Philip, for all the difficulties of being the consort and being 2 steps behind always and not the most important player, she's acknowledging that Philip was able to do it. Philip stuck with it. He may have wandered and strayed now and then, but he was still there.
Although the institution of marriage and a solid family image might be working for Philip and Elizabeth, unfortunately, it soon wouldn't be for the rest of the family.
Well, family's everything to the royals, really. I mean, it's a family, but it's also a firm with major and minor shareholders. And what's interesting is that the institution survives beyond family crises, and there have been many over the years. And the Queen has even had to take evasive action against her own beloved children in a bid to protect the institution.
The first cloud on the horizon for our first family was in 1987, when Prince Edward announced his decision to drop out of his Royal Marine training after just 4 months.
When Edward made his momentous decision to leave the Marines, the one person that was actually very supportive of him was his father.
Prince Edward is said to have coped well with the physical side of things here. After the initial shock, the training apparently was no more of a problem for him than for anyone else. If the reports are true, it was the long-term prospect which caused him to reconsider his future with the Marines.
The Queen took the news with icy displeasure, and the Queen Mother saw it as a dereliction of duty. But Edward's father's reaction was surprising.
Well, I think everybody thinks that Prince Philip is this very hard and difficult man, which indeed he can be, but he's also very sensitive, and he has a very warm relationship with his youngest son. He's always been there for him, perhaps in a way that the Queen's always been there for Andrew.
What's interesting about Prince Philip stepping in may be much more about Prince Philip's journey as a parent. He has had a relationship with his older son where he pushed him down a particular path and persuaded him to go to schools and wanted him to be less emotional than he was. And maybe he learnt something in that process. Parents make mistakes, and if you learn from them, good for you. And maybe this was one of Philip's learnings.
But Edward's shocking decision was nothing compared to the scandalous year of 1992. Not only did Princess Anne divorce Captain Mark Phillips, but the Duchess of York was about to put her foot in it. Literally.
Fergie had been caught topless, having her toe sucked by her financial advisor, Johnny Bryan, in the south of France while Andrew was away. Pretty unfortunate story. And she was going into breakfast, and she was stopped from going into breakfast by a private secretary, suggesting what was actually in the pages of the newspapers, in the tabloids, that it might be a good idea if Fergie went back to London rather than staying at Balmoral, which she did, and she went back pretty quickly. The family were aware of all the pictures. They weren't going to raise it with her. It was left to the private secretary. But yes, I think she was deeply embarrassed by that, that she didn't just let the family down, but she let herself down and her husband down as well.
During the same period, someone else receiving unwanted press scrutiny was Princess Diana.
When Diana was in her most difficult stage, which was probably during the period, when the marriage was really going wrong, and it was what we called the War of the Waleses. Diana was doing terrible damage to the institution of the monarchy, which is what Prince Philip had given up his whole life to support. And it was just the endless headlines.
A divorce, however painful, was inevitable. But after its announcement, things just got worse.
I think what's interesting about 1992 is the palace completely lost control of the situation when it came to the War of the Waleses. The prolonged crisis that engulfed the royal family created a vacuum that was only filled by news coverage and speculation. It was like the greedy monster that kept on needing to be fed. I think at the point where Diana decided to collaborate with Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, and indeed give the famous Panorama interview, the Queen's patience was wearing rather thin.
As a result, tension was visible at Royal Ascot as the second instalment of Morton's book was rolling off the press.
Diana was always the most telling with her body language, and she could say more in one pose in a photograph than most of the royals said in a lifetime of footage. And so we see Prince Philip at Ascot looming near Diana. Now, this is a different Diana to the one that we saw at the wedding, because by now she's a lot more womanly. So she's wearing this very high fashion outfit, very loud spotted outfit, elegantly and with utter confidence. The mouth has dropped and she looks slightly reflective. So clearly the illustration of a rift between those two characters going on there.
After 45 years of marriage and thinking the worst must be behind them, in 1992, everything seemed to be going wrong for the royal couple.
1992, of course, will forever go down in history as the most appalling year for the royal family. 3 out of 4 of the Queen's children divorce. A lot of the salacious details concerning the breakdown of these high-profile marriages is played out in the tabloids. And then to cap it all off, Windsor Castle nearly burns down.
4 days later, at the Guildhall, the Queen delivered her sympathy speech to a standing ovation.
It has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
I think that speech really resonated with the public, who were grateful that the monarch was willing to acknowledge how dreadful the previous 12 months had been. Ordinarily, you expect the Queen to keep calm and carry on and not point to the glaring errors that have been made by her own children. And in this case, I think she just thought, there's no hiding this.
But the 1990s had one final, devastating sting in the tail. An event that nearly ended all Philip and Elizabeth had worked for and brought Britain to the brink of revolution.
Just to confirm the news that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car accident in Paris, which also killed her companion, Dodi Fayed.
Undoubtedly the biggest challenge to the marriage of Philip and Elizabeth, and more importantly to the monarchy, happened in the early hours of the 31st of August 1997.
Just to confirm the news that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car accident in Paris, which also killed her companion, Dodi Fayed.
If in life troublesome and difficult for the monarchy, in death she became a force beyond control, and for the royal couple it brought all their sacrifices and tireless work to the brink of ruin.
When she died, the whole of Britain and the whole of the world became hysterical with grief. And this was not predicted at all by anyone, least of all the royal family. When there's this huge national feeling, it has to be channeled through the monarch. And Elizabeth, or this was the perception, wasn't doing her job.
Very, very, very disgraceful, I find their behaviour. Very disgraceful.
Well, I think it must be very, very cold-hearted not to have a flag up. I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
It wasn't helping that Tony Blair, the Prime Minister at the time, was much more engaged with public sentiment.
The people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess.
His people princess speech was very, very clever. And he spoke before the Queen spoke, but she was following a royal tradition that when somebody dies, you close ranks, and it's family, and the only two people that really matter are the children left behind.
Whatever the truth, it captured the press's imagination, and the Queen, and especially Philip, didn't like it. Secluded in Balmoral, Scotland, Elizabeth was stoically keeping to royal protocol, whilst Philip looked after their bereaved grandchildren. This meant the monarchy were unaware of the magnitude of events 500 miles south in London.
I know that one of the Queen Mother's friends rang her and said, you know, you really should get down here, you lot, because, you know, it's going absolutely crazy here.
They forgot that they're not an ordinary family, and that was a mistake.
When they finally returned to London, the Queen was shocked. And she was actually quite nervous because there was a very bad feeling, almost of revolution, which I've never felt before or since, and I don't suppose the Queen has either.
She stayed stoic. She was almost unflinching in that situation, and that shows a remarkable capability in terms of self-control.
But all Elizabeth's stoicism was put to the test the following day, in a rare address to the nation.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself.
What you can see that is unique in my experience in the Queen's body language, she does 10 lip licks.
I share in your determination to cherish her memory.
This can be read again in different ways. Often when people get a burst of adrenaline, when they get nervous, when they get anxious, when they get fearful, the mouth dries, and that would definitely have caused a necessity of licking the lips. I may be seeing it as fear, maybe a little bit of anxiety, and I'm going to make a blend. I think it might also be tinged with a little bit of annoyance that she's having to do it anyway.
Although the Queen's public address was criticised as being too little too late, her and Philip's presence back in London and at the funeral proved enough for public sympathy.
We all know what it's like to suffer a loss and a pain, and to see the monarch doing the same back, you feel much, much closer to her. So at that point, to see her in that state, I think a lot of people probably wanted to put their arms around her.
Philip also had a hand in maintaining the threatened monarchy.
He was absolutely devastated for his grandsons, extremely close to both boys. It was he who was instrumental in persuading them, rightly or wrongly, to walk behind Diana's coffin, simply by saying that he would be there to support them.
Diana's death was possibly the first time in the Queen's reign when the country did not come first.
The point was, both Grandma and Grandfather did their best in their own way to support those princes at the time. And it was an unprecedented moment. It was an abject tragedy, and they dealt with it in their own way.
The Queen said afterwards that lessons had to be learned from Diana's death. Slowly they have been. And it's worked, with affections reaching new heights in 2012 for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee.
It's absolutely brilliant. So we're thoroughly enjoying it. As you can see, the kids have really made a day of it.
As the Queen and Duke have become older, more of the royal duties have been passed to the younger generation.
William did resist for some time becoming a full-time working royal. He wanted to spend his time in the military. He also wanted to be that air ambulance pilot and achieve a career of sorts on his own terms. But inevitably, when your granny is approaching her 90s and you're married and you're starting a family, there's an emphasis on you having to step up to the plate. I think now the Cambridges are very much admired for the fact that they have sacrificed everything in order to serve Queen and country.
And the Queen's very conscious of the fact that her father wasn't around long enough to tutor her. You've got to remember that she was 25 when he died, so she was still fairly young. And William is doing a very good job what he's doing at the moment, and he is learning the ropes.
After working tirelessly from the sidelines, another royal is now stepping into the limelight.
I think Anne has carved out a very definite role for herself, and I think, like her mother, she has put duty very much in the spotlight. You know, she rolls her sleeves up and she gets stuff done.
Safe in the knowledge the future of the monarchy is in good hands, Philip stepped down from royal duties in August 2017 at the tender age of 96.
And that's a pretty good age to keep going, but there comes a time when, yeah, even Prince Philip had to hang up his spurs.
Philip's retirement signified the end of being seen 2 steps behind the Queen, a position he's held as the Queen's rock for nearly 70 years.
The coronavirus crisis, I think, has given the whole world pause for thought as to what a 94-year-old and a 99-year-old should be doing in terms of their contribution to public life. We want the Queen to remain visible, but at the same time, few would begrudge her putting her feet up a little.
This selfless couple and their relentless dedication to duty have stoically kept the monarchy going.
I think the most remarkable thing about Elizabeth and Philip, they are a team, and as they've got older, the sense that they're a team has become more distinct.
And they are also willing to hold on to tradition while also behaving in progressive ways that we can then relate to. So I think that might be the magic combination.
They're probably more in touch with the people than any other sovereign has been before. They look upon her as reassurance. As long as the Queen's okay, the rest of us are okay.